I trust you have a copy of the Word of God tonight. I'd like to encourage you to turn with me, please, to Mark in chapter number 9. Mark in chapter number 9. As we continue forward in our study through the life of Jesus Christ as chronologically as we can. And we're seeing consistently that people were astonished at both his words and his wisdom. We're trying to find out why. Why were they astonished, and how does his teachings, and sometimes when he didn't say anything at all, how do they apply to us, and how should they impact our walk with him? We've learned many things through this study, and I'll give just a brief review because we're in a section here where there are several truths that kind of just connect one to another. And so I'll give a brief review and then dig into this passage here together. Where are we? Well, the disciples and Jesus had just spent time in Caesarea Philippi. And it was there while they were in Caesarea Philippi that they experienced some things. We found, number one, that they experienced one of their clearest moments yet. And that was when Peter confessed about Jesus, that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Not only was it one of their most clearest moments, we found that it was one of their most confusing moments, because they had certain expectations about what the Messiah would be, or who the Messiah would be, and what the Messiah would do. And Jesus immediately after Peter's confession began to inform them that he was going to be rejected, that he was going to suffer, and that he was going to die, and that those who chose to follow him, many of whom would follow that exact same path. And none of that fit into their expectations of the Messiah. And so it was one of their clearest moments, and yet it was one of their most confusing moments. And then we found that it wasn't just clarity and clarifying and confusing, but it was also very challenging. Because what did Jesus tell them next? That they were to take up their cross, deny themselves, take up their cross, follow him, and not be ashamed. So it's so interesting to me. We always get the three. Deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. We always get those. But we leave out not being ashamed. It's in there too. And so this was a challenge for them, especially since Jesus had just told them what was going to take place. So Jesus, in that particular moment, had given his disciples a lot to think about. And what Jesus understood was that they needed time to process what they had just seen and what they had just heard. And so he gave them just that. He gave them 6 days to take and to process that information. For 6 days, there was silence. There was nothing, until we're told that Jesus took those inner core disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he took them up into a mountain where they saw something that they had never seen before. We said that the glory of Christ's divinity shone through the veil of his humanity. Remember, Jesus was God and man at the same time, 100%. And God, the Father, had prepared a body for Jesus. Remember, he did not have a physical form prior to being born in Bethlehem. God provided a flesh. He provided a body. And so the glory of his deity was veiled in his humanity while he was here on earth. And in that brief moment there on the Mount Transfiguration, what happened was the disciples got I believe, a very small glimpse. Now, I don't think they could have held it all. They got a very small glimpse of his divinity that was now shining through the veil of his humanity. Okay, he was still man, but he was still God. It just was, when he was here on earth, they saw outside in, and at that moment they got to see the inside out. Does that make sense? And so his glory shone. And at that moment, God the Father spoke from heaven and confirmed Jesus' identity. There were two individuals there. There was Moses, a representative of the law, and there was Elijah, a representative of the prophets. And it was confirmation that everything the law and the prophets talked about, all of it pointed to Jesus. The disciples, while they might not have came down the mountain that day having all their questions answered and having a game plan for every moment for the rest of the earthly ministry of Christ or for their own life, wouldn't that have been nice? They had been given enough to go on. You see, God strengthened their faith. And he did so a couple ways. He still does so today. He strengthened their faith by revealing his glory. He strengthened their faith by speaking his word. He strengthened their faith by confirming his plan. And he strengthened their faith by demanding or commanding their focus, their attention. Remember, God the Father said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." And they saw no one but Jesus only. Sometimes that's what we need. We need to get away from the distractions and focus only on Jesus. Now, I'm going to get to the text here in just a moment, but I want to make a connection here. We often like to talk about mountaintop experiences. How many of us like mountaintop experiences? Yeah, absolutely. How many like to live on the mountaintop? I'm a little down here on that. You say, why? There's a lot of things that can't take place on the mountaintop. They can only take place in the valleys. We come here to this particular passage here when this Mount of Transfiguration took place, and we learn some principles about mountaintop experiences. I'm going to give them briefly because it sets the groundwork for where we're going. Mountaintop experiences are moments that are very involved. They're very involved. I'm preacher, what do you mean by that? Well, notice back up in Mark 9 and verse number 2. After 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up where? Into an high mountain apart by themselves. Now, what does that include? If you're going to get to the top of a high mountain, what's got to happen? You got to climb. They didn't have helicopters. They didn't have airplanes. They couldn't jump out of a plane with parachutes on. Okay? They had to climb. Mountaintop experiences are the same way. There's motion, there's movement, there's effort. And they're needed because sometimes, as I just mentioned a moment ago, we need the mountaintop experiences to get us away from the noise and from the distractions of everything going on and the busyness of our life. And we need to get apart from those things. How many understand it can be hard to pull away from things? I mean, our schedules are full, are they not? If yours isn't, I'd love to talk with you. I've got some things you can do, right? Our lives are busy. And to say, I need to have some time where I get alone with God, sometimes that feels easier said than done. Now, let me just go ahead and interject here. You'll never have time for God. You'll never have time. You gotta make it. You gotta make it. Because you'll always have an excuse. You'll always have a reason why I can't or why I don't. And so mountaintop experiences are involved. But not only are mountaintop experiences involved, I want you to understand, and this is the positive note, that mountaintop experiences are incredible. They're incredible. I had the privilege of Josiah this last year for his birthday. He wanted to hike up to the park out, no, not Hunger Mother, the one on out, Grayson Highlands. That's what it was, yeah. He wanted to hike up Grayson Highlands with some of his friends. And so we were looking at the schedule, and there was only one time when it worked for me to take him, and so it was me and Josiah, about 3 or 4 other of his guy friends, and my dad went with us, and we start driving up the mountain, and what's it doing? It's raining. Nah, it's raining. Not just rain. I mean, it's raining, all right? I mean, there's a difference between it's raining and it's raining. It's raining, okay? And it rained the entire time we were there. All the way up the mountain. Boy, it took a little bit of work to get up that mountain with all that water coming down and all that mud and sliding and all. But boy, when you got up to the top. Now, it would have been a lot better had the clouds not been there, obviously, right? But have you seen it without the clouds? Oh, it's breathtaking. That's why we love mountaintop experiences so much. Because we get to learn something. Remember when this transfiguration took place, what does Peter say? It is good for us to be here. That's an exciting moment. Now, he got a little off in his theology and in his application there, yes, but he said it is good. It is good for us to be here. We like mountaintop experiences because they teach us something that we didn't know, and they leave an impression on us that we never forget. It's mountaintop experiences. Not only are they involved and incredible, you understand, thirdly, that they are intentional. They're intentional. If we had time to go to Matthew 17, which is the parallel portion, when all this is done, in verse number 7, Jesus comes to his disciples and he says, "Arise and be not afraid." And really, I think that's connected to what he was just saying, because he had just told his disciples 6 days prior, right, that he's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, suffer, and die, and they're probably going to follow that same path as his followers, and there's fear there. And so I think that there's a purpose behind this transfiguration moment. He was trying to prepare and strengthen the faith of his disciples for what was next in God's plan for their life. Your mountaintop experience and mine are for the same purpose. He gives us enough to go on, to strengthen our faith because of what he knows is coming next. One other thing we understand about mountaintop experiences is that they are intermittent. They're intermittent. You say, what do you mean by that? They don't last long, generally. Their impact lasts long, but the moment doesn't. You get it to that. We got there sitting on the rock, looking down over, eating Vienna sausages. That's what you do. Cans of Vienna sausages and cans of beanie weenies. That's what you do when you go on a hike. Some of you are like, no way. That's good eating right there. Throw in some nabs. I mean, you good to go. Some of you know, those kids, they didn't know what nabs. How many don't know what nabs are? How many don't know what nabs are? Okay, all right. Okay, you don't know what nabs are? Nah, that was a brand of crackers. Okay, a brand of crackers. What they called nabs? Okay, I don't know if they're still around or not. They were called nabs, and so we called nabs. And man, you're sitting up there and you're just thinking, I wish this could last forever. I just love it. The sights, the sounds, the birds flying, the wind, the breeze. I could have done with a little break in the rain, but I mean, beautiful, love it. But the problem was, at some point, what do we have to do? Go back down the mountain. And we come back down off the mountain, what does that mean we're entering back into? The realities of life. That's why we like the mountaintop experiences. Because remember, it separates us from all that. But at some point, we have to come back down. And we enter back in to those realities. Now, here's the key. We should absolutely enjoy mountaintop experiences when God allows them to come into our life. But we should also allow them to strengthen our faith. Because sooner or later, and probably sooner than later, that stronger faith that was supposed to be produced while you were on the mountaintop is going to be needed when you're back in the valley. That's, I think, what happens here in Matthew chapter number 9. Jesus had taken these 3 disciples, that's key, these 3 disciples up on the mountaintop. And now Jesus and these 3 disciples are now descending back down off the mountain. And as these three disciples and Jesus descend off the mountain, they are met at the base of the mountain with a lot of commotion. There's something happening at the bottom of this hill. And what they walked into was simply a reminder of why God had given them the mountaintop experience in the first place. Let's look at it together. Mark 9, verse 14. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, the scribes questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, saluted him. And he asked the scribes, what question ye with them? And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. Wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to the disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. He answered him and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. They brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he asked his father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. And oftentimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. Well, there's a message there, isn't there? But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. Straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. The spirit cried, and rent him sore, and came out of him. And he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, and lifted him up, and he arose. I'll come to the key statement here in just a moment. Jesus, three disciples, Peter, James, and John. They come down off the mountaintop and they hear this commotion, which, for lack of better way to describe it, probably should be described as nothing more than a big mess. Because really that's what you find here at the base of the mountain. It was a big mess. You have the scribes, and what are they doing? They're arguing, they're questioning, they're debating the disciples. Then there's the crowd. There's a crowd that's gathered around the scribes and the disciples, and they're confused. I mean, they're listening to one, they don't know what's going on. The disciples, 9 of them, because remember, the other 3 are with Jesus. 9 of them are there in this crowd, and what kind of state are they in? They're embarrassed. For lack of a better way to say it, would you be? They're embarrassed. Why? Because they couldn't. I'll come back to that. They couldn't do what needed to be done. Right? And men get frustrated and embarrassed when we can't figure it out. That's how we were designed. That's why we kick stuff. In our mind, like that helps. It makes us feel better, right? And in the midst of all of that, you got a father that is absolutely desperate. And you have a son who's suffering the hands of the enemy. What a mess. What a mess. But here's what I want you to understand. The problem here in this passage is not a problem with the demonic realm. Well, that's a whole conversation for another message. Because the demonic realm really does a whole lot of problem making in our world. Problem here is not that there is a demonic spirit that is tearing and hurting this child. Now again, I'm not saying that's a good thing. That wasn't the problem. What was the problem? The problem was a lack of faith. It was a faith problem. I'm just going to say it. I'll make you mad at me all the time anyway. The devil's not the biggest problem you have in your life. Your lack of faith is. That's what's being taught here. The disciples couldn't. Why? Because of a lack of faith. Now I'm going to explain that. I'll get to that. But I want to draw our attention to the fact that we often give our enemy more credit than he deserves. Because we're looking for a way to excuse the real problem, which is us. Well, there's some things important for us to acknowledge when we come to this passage. Number one, we need to acknowledge the fact that Jesus had already given his disciples the authority, and I think that's key, the authority to cast out unclean spirits, okay? And again, another that we could go way, I have rabbit trails running all through my mind tonight. He had given them authority to cast out unclean spirits, Luke 10. And not only had he given them power, but they had done so. Right? He gave them power, and then he sent them out by twos. And when they came back to Jesus, hey, this is what happened. And so they had been given the authority, and they had done it. But this time, here in Mark chapter number 9, here in this moment, something was different. Something was missing. It's not that they didn't try. They tried. What was different? They couldn't. But like the last time when they tried, they did. Now, it was God doing it through, yes, I don't want to make them to be any more supernatural than it was God doing the work, okay? But it didn't work this time. You ever tried something and the first time it worked well and then you went back to do it again and was like, it's well the last time, but it didn't work the same way this time, right? That's what's happened here. Now can you imagine? Put yourself in the mindset of the disciples. They've tried. They failed. This father now takes the son that they tried to help and couldn't help, and this father goes to Jesus and says, I took my son to your disciples, but they could not. What's that do to a guy? Oh, man. You talk about take a heart out of a man's chest, throw it on the ground, and stomp it a couple times. That's what that will do. Because we'll die trying. We'll try to fix that plumbing all day long, and it might be worse by the weekend, but we're going to try. And when we fail, like that's the state these disciples are in. Now, this father, he did what he should have done. He brought his son to the disciples. Now, bear with me, because you thought I was going to say something else, didn't you? And he did. Eventually, he brought his son to Jesus. Now, had Jesus been going throughout Galilee and healing and touching lives and changing lives? Yes, absolutely. But what had some of these people only seen? Some of them had only seen his disciples do so. And so this father took his son to whom he thought could help him. And he took him to the disciples. Now, I don't want to diminish that. Because I think sometimes what God does is he allows people to bring their needs to his people, who then can point them to the only one who can meet their need. Do you understand and realize, or you need to understand and realize, that your limitation could indeed be a good thing? I know, we don't often think of it that way. I have it in my notes this way. Your limitations should turn into directions that produces an invitation for someone to go to Jesus. Did you follow? Your limitation should produce directions that turn into an invitation for someone to take their needs to Jesus. Because when it boils down to it, I can't help you apart from Christ. Can't do it. He's the one that enables me to do so. And by the way, it's not my responsibility to take the credit for something that only he can do. So this father, the disciples can't do it. He takes his son to Jesus. Jesus takes and heals this man's son. Now again, I don't think the focus is on the healing of the man's son. I think the focus is back on the disciples. Because what happens next is the disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, why couldn't we cast out the demon? Look in verse number 28. And when he was come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could not we cast him out? And he said to them, this kind can come forth by nothing but prayer and fasting. Now don't miss this statement. This is the key thought for the entire message. God will give you enough to go on, but he will never give you enough that you no longer need him. God will give you enough to, remember they were on the mountaintop. God gave them enough to go on. But he will never give you so much that you don't still need him. This is the balance. Mountaintop, mountaintop, look at all this incredible, yeah, limitation. What does it do? It reminds me of who I am and who I need. One of the greatest problems, and I think we see it in the passage here, Jesus is looking at these 9 disciples. Now remember, there's 3 that went up the mountain with Jesus. There's 9 that were still at the base. There were 3 that saw the transfiguration of Jesus. There were 9 that were in the mess down the valley, okay? It was these 9 down in the valley that had a problem. I think the problem was twofold. Number one, I think they had a problem with overconfidence. Anybody else struggle? That would be all of us. Overconfidence. You see, they had a record. And what was the record? God had given us the authority to cast out demons. We've cast out demons, and so we ought to be able to cast out this demon. And when they couldn't cast out the demon, something was wrong with them. That's overconfidence. They had allowed yesterday's victories to replace today's dependence. Now, what do I mean by that? What God did in your life yesterday is important. Matter of fact, this morning, did we not just preach that? To remember your past victories. Those are needed. Those are good. But you can live in the past so much that you're of no present good. Because what God did yesterday, while it brought you to where you are, it is not designed to take you further than where you are right now. Because God will give you enough to go on, but he will never give you more than enough that you don't need him. So he leads you from point A to point B, and then he leads you from point B to point C, and then he leads you from point C to point D. But at any moment you begin to think that you are better than you really are, you're going to stop going to him, which means you're no longer ready to go to the next spot. You see, the issue was not necessarily an issue with pride or arrogance. I don't think that was the issue. I think the issue was with familiarity. The longer that you know Christ as your Savior, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of being a child of God, things become familiar, don't they? And what happens with things that become familiar? Was it? You get complacent in it. They lose something. They don't seem as valuable anymore. For a child of God, that can be your Bible study time. That's why you get to the end of the day and you go, oh, I didn't study my Bible today. Because again, as I said earlier, you'll never have time unless you make time. And you won't make time when something is so familiar, you don't feel like you need the time. Spoiler alert, you need the time, okay? But familiarity weakens that, right? Prayer time. What made the church of yesteryear so powerful? They knew how to pray. What do we not do today? We don't pray. Oh, we pray, but we don't pray. There's a difference. Why? Because most of the time we don't feel like we have time to pray. And most of the time we don't pray. Why? Because we feel like we can handle it. Isn't that overconfidence? Wasn't necessarily an issue with a problem of pride, although I'm sure that is mixed in here. There is an issue of a lack of power. Now, I don't want you to think I'm being mystical, okay? I can't somehow touch you and you be healed, okay? I'm not going to go through the motions and try to slay you in some... I can't do that. Now, if I didn't put deodorant on this morning, that might be another story. I can't do that. And so when I talk about a lack of power, that's not what I'm talking about, okay? Are you with me? And yet as a child of God, what must I have? I must have power. I have to have strength. And it is strength that has to come from outside of me. Because when it boils down to it, I'm not capable. But in a relationship with God, what does God do? He gives strength to the faint. He gives strength to the weary. And at some point in your day, in some point in your week, somebody's going to come to you and they're going to need something from you that is designed, that is God's plan to flow from Him through you. But if you're lacking that power that is needed from Him, now we have a breakdown. Now we have a disconnect. What'd the Father say? I brought my son to your disciples to heal my son, but they could not. There are people through your week, and again, I'm not saying that you can heal them. What I'm saying is this: there are people in your week that God has intended for you to be a hand of blessing to, for you to be an encouragement to, for you to be a blessing to, For you to have that word that's really not yours, it's coming from the Lord, but you've spent time in His presence and you have power from on high. You have God that has poured Himself inside of you, and now He flows through you and He meets a need in that person's life because you had the power from God that you needed to be that part in the process. There's overconfidence. One of the greatest things, one of the biggest, the fear that I have is that the biggest majority of Christians today have no or little spiritual strength. And it goes back to what we were talking about in Sunday school this morning. Why? Because there's no true worship and there's no true devotion. Our walk with Christ and our service to the Lord becomes second nature, second hand, not nature, second hand. And everything else and everyone else takes the place of what should be His. So the first problem, I think, was overconfidence. Their second problem, I think, was prayerlessness. He says this kind comes not but how? Through prayer and fasting. Again, a whole nother thought for a whole nother day. When it comes to our prayer life, we have to understand that prayer is not just a part of our battle, spiritually speaking. Prayer is the battle. And it's the battle that most of us fail at. It is. When we neglect prayer, we're not just neglecting something that we're supposed to do. We're actually robbing ourselves of the resource that we need, which is God's supply that Paul talks about. We're robbing ourselves of the resource that we need to overcome the struggles that's in our own life and to be a help to those around us who are going through struggles of their own, that God has strategically positioned us in that particular place to be a help to them in their time of need. It is God doing the work through His people. We have to understand that while past victories are a testimony of God's faithfulness and as a sign of our past dependence, just because God did something in your life powerfully yesterday doesn't mean that you're at a spot today for God to do the same thing. He hasn't changed, but we might have. This is why we encourage you to prioritize your walk with God. Again, I remind you that God will give you enough to go on, but He will not give you enough that you don't need Him. That's where our title comes from. That's why sometimes enough doesn't really feel like enough. Because I have enough to go on, but I still need more. Now here's the good news. God's ready to give more. The Bible says that He gives grace for grace. Grace upon grace has the idea of grace being heaped upon grace, upon grace, upon grace, upon grace. I need that. Why? Because I got enough today to get me through this, but now I need enough now to get me through that. That's how the Christian life is designed to be lived. For you to consistently have what you need to move forward, but for you to consistently have to go back to Him for more to go even farther. Now, I want to draw our attention back to this father. Because there is a difference between this father who was desperate for the condition of his son and these 9 disciples who were supposed to be able to help, but who weren't able to help. Notice this father. Verse number 21. He asked his father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. And oft times it hath cast him in the fire and in the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. You see, what we find here in this passage, what we find in this father, is a faith that needed help. We find a faith that needed help. By the way, what does all faith need? All faith needs help. Why? Because God gives you enough to go on, but not more than enough to where you don't need to go back to Him. So all faith needs help. And what Jesus does with this father is He doesn't criticize this father's faith. Question, how strong was this father's faith? Okay, how many say, preacher, I think his faith was strong? How many say, preacher, I think his faith might have been a little weak? I think his faith was a little weak. Let me show you where I get it. What does he say in verse number 22? And oft times it had cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But what? If thou canst do anything. Is that strong faith? What does strong faith say? He can do all things. That's strong faith. Is this strong faith? No, this is weak faith. If thou canst do anything. You say, well, preacher, that's the desperation. Yeah, that shows where your faith needs help. Because all faith needs help. What kind of faith does his father have? He has honest faith. He wasn't sure if Jesus could help him or not. He didn't know. But honest faith is still faith. Did this father have doubting faith? But what is doubting faith? Doubting faith is still faith. Did this father have weak faith? But what is weak faith? It's still faith. What are we saying? It's where God works. Wherever you are, in whatever situation you're in, He's given you enough to get to where you are right now. And He has enough to get you past now, to whatever's next. But what do you have to do? You've got to go to Him. And when you go to Him, what happens? Well, what did He do with the disciples up on the mountaintop? Did He not reveal Himself to him? Did He not speak His word to him? Did He not confirm His plan to him? He did the exact same thing with the Father in the valley that He did with the 3 disciples up on the mountaintop. And what happens to the dad? Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. Faith that needed help. And what does Jesus do? He heals His son. What am I saying? I need to close. I like this all the time. Jesus has always been enough. Jesus will always be enough. He will always give you enough. What was it Jesus told Paul? My grace is, That's enough. But he'll never give you so much that you don't need to go to him. So what do I do? What do I do when enough doesn't feel like enough? I do what I'm supposed to. I take my need and I go to Jesus. And I say, Lord, I believe. I have faith. But I need help. Help thou mine unbelief. That's what you do when enough doesn't feel like enough.